Hi everybody, my name is Mike, founder and CEO of Reaching Higher Ed, and I want to thank all of our viewers for joining Reaching Higher Ed on its first ever live broadcast on Facebook and YouTube. And if you're joining us from any one of these platforms, I'm going to ask that you hit the like button on Facebook or hit the subscribe button on YouTube so you can be notified of future videos just like this one. And please don't forget to share this video. Reaching Higher Ed has pulled together a group of education experts who are going deep today on the topic of race, racism, and activism in education. So whether you're a parent, a student, a teacher, or a college administrator, this is one viewing you do not want to miss. So please, without further ado, get ready for Reaching Higher Ed presents Race, Racism, and Activism in Education. Let's get started.
It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream.
I'd like to welcome my first panelist, Dr. Catalina Gonzalez, who serves as Assistant Dean for the College of Education and Human Services at Montclair State University. Dr. Gonzalez is a scholar practitioner and an adjunct professor whose research interests include access, equity, and the academic success of underrepresented students in higher education. My next panelist is Dr. Don Lee Apliers, commonly known as Dr. Don. Don is the Director of Family and Community Engagement at the New York State Education Department, where he oversees the administration of over $36 million for the New York State My Brother's Keeper Initiative and Liberty Partnership Program. Our next guest is Dr. Bridget McCurtis, who serves as the founder and Chief Education Officer for Beyond Measure Coaching and Consulting LLC. Having served in administrative roles for almost 25 years, Dr. McCurtis has been able to utilize her training background to help individuals provide strategic team guidance focused on inclusion, accountability, connectivity, and excellence that has helped individuals and organizations take their talents to new heights. And last but not least, we have Will De Los Santos. Will works for the Office of Leadership Development at Vanderbilt University, where he equips student organizations with the resources to empower their members to engage in and create meaningful experiences that enable them to develop vital skills that add value to the communities they serve. Well, I am extremely excited to have you all here, particularly in the wake of national events that are occurring. As we all know, over the last few months, besides dealing with a pandemic, we have been dealing with a wave of national protests due to the killings of Black lives. Most recently, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd, among others. And at the heart of the issues and the protests that are going on, of course, we get to this issue of race and racism. And so I thought it was important to bring you all here today, and I'm excited to have you, and definitely thank you all for your time. So why don't we begin here with our first question, and I'm going to direct this question to Dr. Bridget McCurtis. And if you can start off telling us, why do you think it's important to discuss race and racism in K-12 and higher education spaces?
Part of the reason I think it's really important that we discuss race is that when we don't, we are missing the core of who people are when they arrive. So as a person who, my research and my background and interest is around racial identity, when we look at the various racial identity theories, whether they be multiracial identity, most of them have built off of psychological regressants by William E. Cross, which started with Black students in various stages, or Black people in various stages of race. But we've come to a place in America, and we're in a different moment now. But up until this point, we've come to a place where we've wanted to do melting pot. We wanted to do a salad bowl. We wanted to do a variety of things. But when we're saying that, we still were ignoring the core developmentally what people come to. So I think it's important to begin with what you come to school with. So we're in school, we have a 12 o'clock life, and we come to school for about, three of those hours. And so when we choose to ignore that, we're ignoring developmentally the core of what's important. I think, one of the things when I thought of this question, I thought about Part of what we don't do often is we as administrators, as teachers, as security guards, as lunch people, all those people who are important in the life of a student, we often don't talk about our race. And when we deal with it every day, we go to meetings, we're in classrooms, people are dismissed, people say slights, they say microaggressions, various things. And we often do a disservice to students when we really sometimes want to say, I'm mad too, or I'm sad too, or even that, let me tell you what I'm doing for you outside of this. Because I think we actually are doing a disservice to students when we are not talking about race. So we live in America. And the one very unique thing about America is that race has been possibly the most prolific thing in our life that has directed who we are socially, strategically, economically, housing, all kinds of things. But it's probably the one thing that we've chosen to not talk about very much. And so we haven't been having honest conversations with our young people. And so we haven't had honest conversations, so they're not prepared when they walk in the door and race is what hits them first.
Thank you for that. Dr. Clear, same question.
It's interesting, and I certainly agree with a lot of what Dr. McCurtis has shared. Of course, as educators, we have an obligation to ensure that our students are not just only fully engaged in scholarship, but also are able to utilize those critical thinking skills, those problem solving skills, and critical discussions related to race and analyzing social issues such as race and racism. It's also very important to realize that, every student that comes into a classroom has their own experience, their own lived experience. And it's important that we are able to create safe opportunities and safe spaces for them to have meaningful dialogue and conversation as relates to race, especially being able to share their own personal experiences, because race is as American as American pie, and unless we are authentic and true in terms of having those discussions, that as Dr. McCurtis said, we do a disservice to our students. But the question that I always have as relates to not so much the importance of the discussion, but what is the intended outcome? Or what are some of the intended outcomes? Because we can have the discussions, right? We can say, okay, well, we're going to have a conversation about what happened, last month with George Floyd. But what is the intention behind the conversation in terms of the outcome? Is it just more so to, have a informational session? Is it a venting session for students? Is it, coming together to have a kumbaya moment? Or is it really to be intentional about let's take a critical approach to this issue in our country and really be intentional about how we not only articulate our own lived experiences, but also understand the lived experiences of others to essentially come to a point where we can begin to find solutions and have our students be contributing members of our society.
Mike, can I add something quickly?
Absolutely, please do.
Thank you for that, because I think what really important thing you said is that, in terms of communicating, we're not taught to talk about race because we've been taught to ignore it. But we may talk about it at home, but that does not mean that we know how to talk about it across differences, whether that be gender lines, whether that be, as my family migrated, because it's own migration experience from the South. So the Great Migration. But that looks very different, our conversations about race, than it does if you are first generation Dominican, or if you were second generation, or if you were born there, or, and so we're not taught, so we assume that we might have some common experiences, which we've embraced that commonality. But when we get to the real conversation, part of what we need to adopt in our curriculums, as much as we're talking about communication and communication styles, we should be teaching how to talk about race.
Thank you for adding that. Very, very important points. I'm going to direct the next question to Dr. Gonzalez. And that question is, how can classroom and campus settings be used to empower students who may feel powerless and or anxiety filled in the wake of the recent killings of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor?
Thank you for the question. I mean, I think that part of it is understanding the core of the issue initially, right? And understanding the why and taking a stand on it. Many institutions decide to either take a blind eye or provide a soft-toned announcement and saying, you know, we embrace everyone, and we don't see color, and really creates sort of an experience or spaces for students to not feel like they're safe to come out with their own experiences and be real about their own experiences. And you see that seeped in through institutions. You see that in classrooms. You see that where faculty are not all encompassing, and allowing students to, and providing a safe space in the classrooms for students to be who they are and to speak about their lived experiences. You also see that in services where students come to specific offices where they're seeking for help, and they don't feel comfortable with whoever is in front of them, because again, that sort of that attitude, or the way that the institution approaches it, is not it's not firm, right? It's not an anti-racist firm stance. And so the way that I look at the institution's role is they have a role to humanize students, humanize the experiences of students, understand and acknowledge that not all students have a monolithic experience, right? Not all Latinx students speak Spanish or have the same immigrant story, you know? Not all Black students have the same experiences, right? And so I think part of it is humanizing it, but also then providing not only the students, but also the training and the background support of its, and I should say expectation of its faculty and staff to deepen their knowledge, deepen their understanding of their student population, right? And then while also providing the students with a safe space to feel like they can come out with their lived experiences, and then their classmates feel like, I now understand a little deeper what you were referring to, right? Like let's have a conversation about it, because there's a lot of hesitancy in doing so, given given fear of saying something wrong, or just not knowing how to approach the issue. So that's what I will say the institution's role is in providing spaces for students to do that.
Thank you. Very, very insightful. I'm going to direct the same question to Will. Would you please add to that question?
Thanks for the question. With that, piggybacking off of what Dr. Gonzalez said, I think it's also important that all professionals within the campus community take a long and hard look at their institutional structures and dynamics as well, because I feel that that's something that also impacts how they show up in their professional settings, and also how they show up, whether it's in the classroom or in front of students. For example, if politically they don't feel safe, and I'm obviously speaking from professionals of color's point of view here, chances are they have to really redirect and really think about how they're going to approach serving other students. And so, and understanding and really being thoughtful about the consequences that, how that service was provided may bring. And so it's very important that even certain professionals feel safe in providing those services, especially to students of color. In addition to that, I'm also just echoing that there needs to be more intentionality, if you will, about building and deepening relationships with the campus community, because that essentially will allow for just the real work to take place. I firmly believe that the deeper and the stronger the relationships are, even if misunderstandings take place, if that relationship is solid, then there will be opportunities to grow. There will be opportunities to provide the right services. There will be opportunities for students to feel more encouraged and empowered to reach out if they need more assistance and more support. And so, yeah, I think that that's very vital when it comes to these situations. I think one of the most empowering things that you can do for students is give them a voice in certain spaces and allow them to express themselves in ways that they feel comfortable and in ways that they feel affirmed. And so, yeah, and so most importantly, we as professionals, I see, at least my role in particular, is making sure that I am creating an environment that allows them to do that, that allows them to feel safe, and that fosters, just good faith altogether. And so if I can do that and also make sure that my colleagues and I are good in that process, then I know I can provide something for these students.
Thank you both. That was very powerful and insightful, and particularly the piece about giving students a voice. Maybe we can just touch on that a little bit more, and I'll open it up to all the panelists. How do we make sure that students have a voice and yet still feel safe? And who's responsible for ensuring that voice is heard? And it's for any of the panelists.
Sure, and that's a great question in terms of the responsibility, in terms of who is responsible to ensure that students' voices are heard. Because I think very often, at times, especially in education, and again, I can speak from my K-12 experience. Sometimes the understanding and the thought is that, well, that's not our responsibility. Right, that's the responsibility of the family or the community. We're just here to educate what kids need to learn within the textbooks in order to be successful on assessments and so forth. But I can tell you, in my experience, both as a classroom teacher and as an administrator, I bear that responsibility, especially with educating students that are black and brown in the classroom. Because again, we can't ignore it. We can't expect our students to turn a blind eye to the things that they see and encounter on it every day, and recognizing that they spend a good portion of their life within the classroom. Again, we have to allow those spaces for young people to share and express, what are they feeling? What is their understanding of what's going on? What is their family's stance in terms of what's going on? Because all those things will shape, again, what they think, how they view society, how they understand the topic, and ultimately how they respond, right? So again, the responsibility is on educators, because again, at the core of what educators are is to help enlighten and to help to bring knowledge to students, but also to help make sense of the knowledge and information that students bring to the classroom, right? To make it a very meaningful experience. So,
thank you both. So, Dr. Gonzalez, along the same vein, how can educators, whether teachers, faculty, administrators, et cetera, help support, educate, and engage students on topics of race, particularly during the waves of protest and unrest? And we all know that we're now, a lot of schools, particularly K-12, is doing remote learning. Well, higher ed as well is remote learning. And so how can we support, educate, engage students on the topics of race during waves of protest and unrest and remote learning, particularly during this pandemic?
Yes, excellent question, but a very complex one, because, as my colleagues were talking about helping students or providing students with the spaces and the experiences to find their voice and tailor their voices as well for productive outcomes. We do that work on one end, and then they go to the classrooms or they go to their campuses or to their schools, and they open textbooks where their histories aren't represented there, or they are, but with a different lens. And so it's sort of this, these conflicting messages that students, depending on their, their stage, they have to grapple with, and they're sort of like trying to figure out and make sense of it themselves. So what our responsibility is to provide, well, first to take ownership of what does my syllabus look like, right? Do my readings reflect the diversity of this particular topic for this particular class, right? Are there authors or researchers or scholars that have diverse viewpoints on here? Do take responsibility, do an audit of what you're offering, what kind of learning experiences you're offering to students, and disrupt that. Get to a point that you're feeling some level of discomfort in doing that. And when you do feel that, that's because you're likely doing the right thing. It's very important to understand the history. So not only focus on the moment, not only focus on the action of these uprisings and the current ongoings that have been going on for years, right? But understand the context of it and the history of it, and how and why it is systemic. So the system of education hasn't been set up to think about all students, right? Obviously, there are different examples and different models and different schools that take a different approach to education. But the system itself, when you reach a certain point, it's not meant for everyone, right? It's meant to track, it's meant to separate, it's meant to distract some students from accomplishing greater goals. And so we have a responsibility in dismantling that, and we do it one by one, right? We do it each day when we step into that classroom, or each day when we step onto our campuses.
Thank you for sharing that, and truly very, very powerful and insightful. And so as we're discussing remote learning, Will, this question's for you. How can students help create safe spaces for other students to discuss race and racism, particularly when we're in the midst of remote learning?
One of the most powerful resources that the student communities, and I'm of course speaking from a college university setting, one of the most important, most powerful resources that could be used are student organizations. Student organizations obviously have access to resources on campus, and they really play a very critical role in helping students find a sense of belonging. And so those organizations they do a good job, or they can do a good job of pretty much helping students find their way around campus, helping them navigate their identities as they develop as leaders. And so you can just simply start with a general body meeting. That's all it takes to just get the conversation started, right? Getting students to really critically think about how they want to make an impact on this campus. They have the abilities to even connect with student government, right? These are the people, the student body presidents are the ones that are connected most to the executive leadership on campuses. So that way they have opportunities to inform students on what executive leadership is thinking about on campus in terms of what changes they want to make. And this is also an opportunity for that president to serve as a liaison and basically let these executive leaders know what's going on with the student body, what they're thinking, what changes they want to make, what conversations they want to have with other leaders. And so if those, as long as those conversations continue to happen, being put in the forefront and making sure that executive leadership understands the impact of how, for example, their policies are being implemented and how that's impacting students, constantly utilizing these resources to just bring that to their attention is a good first step. Again, general body meetings, as I mentioned earlier, is also a good way to get those conversations started. Because, I think that those are safe spaces to begin with. You have students interacting with students. Now, if they want that institutional translation, then you have advisors. You have faculty members, you have staff members who can provide them with that insight, as I think Dr. McCurtis was mentioning earlier, with helping with the tailoring, right, of those desires, in a subtle way, of course. Then you have those opportunities to help them to, whether it's redirect or just really hone in on what they want. And so I think when we're discussing, race and racism, especially within remote education now, I think we have the opportunity also to discuss those outcomes too. I think now we also have the opportunities to be more creative about our programming series and efforts. And I actually think that it's cheaper at this point. Less money is being spent, I think, on programming and just due to social distancing. And so that can allow students to redirect their resources and use them in a more, creative way. And so they have opportunities to kind of raise their options and make an impact in that way.
Thank you. And so, let's stick with the remote education for a minute. And you mentioned programming actually being cheaper. And I'm just wondering if the panel has any examples or ideas that they can share with any educators who are listening right now about how to get creative with, programming, dealing with race and racism and doing that remotely.
Go ahead, Dr. Gonzalez.
So, I would just share very quickly. I mean, the use of Zoom is it's obviously becoming or has become a default for us educators, for many educators. But its functionality with breakout rooms, I believe, are really powerful, because what I have found is that when you provide a space to do debriefing or processing, and students come on, or whoever your audience is comes on, and there's more than about 10 or so participants there, it doesn't feel like a space where people would want to share, at least, again, depending on the amount of participants. So the use of breakout rooms is a very powerful tool, because it provides a smaller space of community for students to do that. I think that also the use of an example of what you're doing, Mike, right? So having a webinar series, or inviting students to come on and do small sessions, 20-minute sessions with a guided question or with a guided topic about their viewpoint or their experiences, or highlighting just a particular aspect of their experiences at the specific college or university, right? And perhaps an action item. The last thing I would say is I wanted to add to my colleague Will was saying, is that with regards to the use of student organizations. So a really great example is the University of Minnesota student body president, right, who was really the catalyst behind the university cutting ties with the police department, right? I don't know if you got a chance to look at her letter, but the letter that she wrote to the administration was so powerful and so well organized and so professionally written. I was impressed.
Thank you. And Dr. McCurtis, many young people feel compelled to protest and have their voices heard. How can educators best support these efforts? And we have given some examples. Everybody here has given some examples. But I'm curious, we have students who may not have access to technology, particularly when we're talking about underserved communities. And so for those students, they need their voices heard as well. So how can we, particularly during a pandemic, best support them
If you don't mind, I'm going to start a little more general.
Sure, absolutely.
The general piece is, so I love students. They have been my life for the past 20 something years. I was not feeling connected to Gen Zs. It has been said that I said they made me quit my job. But what I realized is that I didn't understand them. And I was probably at just a place in my life where I didn't care to learn to understand them in that way. I wanted to help the people who helped them, and now I advise those who work directly with them. And I still do some student stuff. But part of where we can do better is we haven't taught Gen Zs the history of protest, how to protest. And some of that is because we don't know ourselves. The generation that most of us are probably in, we weren't protesting. Our parents might have. And so part of what you're seeing now, so I was just having a conversation with somebody on the street about looting. And they were saying, well, they're not going to touch that business. That's a Black-owned business. And I said, well, my brother-in-law who lives on the south side of Chicago and owns a Black-owned business, his business was looted. And he was the only Black-owned business in the plaza that he's in the South Loop. And part of that is because I recognize looting is not protesting. Let's be clear on that. But it is a form of protest. It's a form of saying we're tired, we're sick, and of course we know there are people who are taking advantage of. But the reality is it has always been a part of the history, but there are no rules and there's no protocol anymore. And so there used to be things, and I think we're not sharing some of that history, and we're not listening. So I was no longer listening. And I need to take, while I would say, oh, they're tired, they're lazy, they're this, they're that, they're moving on so quickly, everything is in 30 seconds. Then I need to capitalize on that and work with that. So I think part of that general piece is how do we work how students work? Because they have the energy, they have the interest, they have access to more information than any of us ever considered we would have. And so part of I just wanted to say that general piece is we need to do a little more educational, and we need to adjust our style to them versus them adjusting their style. So one of the questions when I've done several panels with career groups who were high school students. And the first question I would always ask is, does everybody have technology? Does everybody have access? And a lot of these were low income students. Most of them have some level of technology. Now, whether it's reliable, whether you want someone to see what's happening in the background, whether, there are a variety of things. And so in a pandemic or in a place where you are not able, we have to get creative and we have to think about as safe as we can be. How do we have some of these interactions in potentially small groups that provide space at times to see face to face? So I think technology is widespread and making sure that they know what access they have. So every library was offering free resources. Several cell phone companies were offering, I'm not saying the service was the greatest, but they were offering service. And so part of our responsibility is to make sure that they understand the access, that they can still participate, because the reality is this pandemic experience has at minimum shown us or continue to drive home the disparities that exist among people, particularly people with brown skin. And not just brown skin, but brown skin because we often link that to income levels. We know that they're separate, but we recognize that they're often conflated, and in many of our neighborhoods, they're not even getting the basic access, and so they just don't know.
Dr. Pleers, same question.
Honestly, I feel like the best way to support them to have their voices heard is to actually listen. I think very often as educators, we get so accustomed to being the givers of information and not necessarily being accustomed to being the receivers of information. And whether it's in a classroom, remote learning, or whatever the platform is, we have to allow the opportunity for us to just stand back and just hear from our students. In my role at the State Education Department, we recently did a virtual village meeting just to hear from students in terms of how is this impacting you? How is COVID? How has this, impacted you? What are some things that you have seen that have given you hope in your communities? What are some things that you have done to really help either your family or community, and really just hearing their voices, empowering students to hear that voice, and as educators, really being the facilitators of that discussion, and facilitating their voice being heard. And as it relates to protest, I think it's really important to help students articulate the why. Why do you want to protest, right? And not say that we disagree or agree, but just tell me why do you want to protest? What is it that you're protesting? Help me understand what you're seeing, what you're feeling, what you're understanding, so that I can learn how to best support you in articulating or making sure that your voice is heard and not silencing your voice. So tell me why, tell me, what it is that you are trying to accomplish, so that I can strategize with you to elevate your voice.
Protesting also is them finishing school, getting that degree, getting in that. And so we need to help them understand. You all know that activism is also, yes, I know you want to be in the street, but go to class first. Mm-hmm. And there are things you can do. You can write your, congressman. You can, there are other things that you can do as well in terms of protest. And so part of that, helping them understand that activism and protest is not just being in the street with a t-shirt on and
absolutely. That's why I say helping them to strategize that, right? Because that strategy may be, hey, look, if you got an issue with how police are handling things in your community, hey, okay, let's go see if there's a citizens review board or community policing board that you can get engaged with or write to or to have some engagement with. So again, part of it is first hearing their voice, and then helping them to find the avenues in which they articulate and elevate their voice. And that's going to look differently for different students.
Will, are there other avenues of activism that students and educators should be aware of, particularly in education settings?
Programming, right? I think about that all the time on my end. In my area, we try to provide as much programmatic support as we can, whether it's financially, whether it's making sure that they understand the policies and guidelines that impact the activities that they make, and also just giving those students a space to even let us know that, these policies are not working for us right now. So, we try our best to make sure that we give them the ear to do that. And again, making sure that our faculty and staff are connected so that if they hear things, that we're communicating with each other. So again, it all goes back to just utilizing your community as best as you can.
And Dr. McCurtis, you touched on this a little bit. Maybe you can expound. With many students at home due to COVID-19, within their communities, how can they be advocates within their local communities?
So because I don't want to forget the point, I do want to make sure that one of the things I think we need to say about being an advocate is when we're working with students, we need to remember developmentally where they are. And I think we need to start with their emotions. And so we need to make sure that people are able to express their emotions, because that emotion then turns into something else once they start protesting, if they have not been able to express that emotion. So that partly where, while we may start angry and we may end angry, but making sure there's an opportunity for people to express their emotions, and for us as administrators, as teachers, as facilitators of this, making sure that we can handle those emotions. So being brown does not mean that I have the appropriate training to manage their emotions and help them channel them to where they need to be. So I just want to make sure that I add that point in. So a lot of students, so when I've talked to students, some of them are not particularly engaged and they don't want to say that they're not engaged. But after asking some more questions, I realized because things are either they don't understand what's happening, or they're not going towards activities that interest them. Part of that, when we're talking about what activism looks like in different ways, in your community, what's important to you? So if you used to go to the Frederick Douglass Community Center every week after school, what's happening there? Recognizing that some of this may be happening virtually, but when you think about, if art is your thing, is there a place in the community that we can come together and build a mural? Is there a local artist? Can I go to my art teacher who I'm talking to virtually and ask them, are there things that I can do that I may not be the person who is standing and protesting? I personally have not participated in a protest. I did watch one from across the street. And someone said to me, well, why? Don't you feel bad? And I said, I've protested with my life. My entire career has been about access and opportunity. That does not mean that I won't go out to a protest. But what it does mean is that I'm clear on where I can be my best. And so that's why I'm doing trainings. And so I think that part of what students can do is express what their interests are and be okay with that. And then to connect with local organizations, connect with people they know, and ask them, what is there to do? What can I do? It's okay. Don't feel bad if you don't know what there is to do. There are people out here who can direct you.
Dr. Gonzalez, what do we say to students who contend that all lives matter during the Black Lives Matter movement?
We hear this or we see this all in social media or even in the news, just folks not really understanding the concept of all Black lives mattering. And the reality is that that's true. All lives should matter and all lives do matter. But we also know and we also see that when you look at the data and when you look at history and you look at the current state of things, you see that there are differences, stark differences in the way that Black and Brown students are taught, low-income students are taught, which of course, as my colleague, Dr. McCurtis said, they're different, but oftentimes are conflated. We also see differences in the health system and the prison system, as well as housing system. I grew up in the projects in New York City, in East Harlem. So you see how one block or one section looks a certain way, and you go to the other block, you cross the street, and it's totally different. And so when you see these sort of anecdotal evidence and actual hard data, you notice that there is a difference in lives, some lives not mattering as much as others. And so the reality is that when we can fully claim that Black lives matter, then we get closer to truly meaning and saying and realizing that all lives do matter. And so with students, I haven't experienced that with students in my classrooms or in my spaces, but I stand very firmly in educating students that all Black lives do matter, and we need to continue saying that in order for all lives to truly matter.
Thank you. And Dr. Pleers, maybe the same question with a slightly different twist. So for students who may meet educators within their spheres, within the classroom setting or otherwise, that contend that all lives matter during the Black Lives Movement, how do we encourage or direct students to respond?
Yes. So this one is interesting because of course I have my personal feelings about it, and whenever people say all lives matter, my initial response is, okay, that's fine. So why discount a subset of those lives, right? Why discount a subgroup of the lives that you say that all matter? And as was articulated, yes, all human life matters. All human life is important. However, when we can just look at the history, we can see the disparity of resources that have been, I would say, intentional to a particular group. It's really hard to say that all lives matter, because all lives matter would mean that every subgroup is provided with the equity and resources that are necessary in order to thrive. And that's essentially what the Black Lives Matter movement is rooted in. It's like, look, we have these systemic inequities that continue to be perpetuated in criminal justice, in economics, in education, in healthcare, and so forth, that continue to negatively impact Black lives across this country. So in terms of what would I do to help one to understand that, and I think, you know, I forget the brother's name, but he said it so eloquently in his comic stance or whatever, his stand up, when he talks about, you know, the idea that, you know, people are so quick to say, well, all lives matter, right? But if you look at the case of, you know, 9/11 was, you know, one of the most horrific events in this country's history. But are we going around saying all buildings matter, right? Are we going around and just saying, okay, well, we will never forget, you know, 9/11 and the Twin Towers? Are we saying that all buildings matter? Should I wear a T-shirt on 9/11 that says all buildings matter? You know, so and you know, again, that's kind of like a light way of thinking about it, but at the same time, it's, you know, we can't pick and choose when things matter and things don't. Either they do or they don't. And as some will say, all lives can't matter until Black lives matter. Because again, the evidence is clear as day, whether it's criminal justice, etc. That is just not Michael Che. Yes, that's the name. Thank you, Will. But yeah, it's just pretty clear that, you know, there's deeply rooted in this country is a subset of people whose lives have not been valued. You know, it's been written in the Constitution. You know, it's been viewed that we were brought here as property and not considered people. So when you have something like that that's embedded in, again, the fabric of this country, you know, when people are saying all lives matter, it's like, which lives are you talking about, right? Whose lives? Because in our history is, you know, we were considered property and three-fifths of a man. So, you know, what's really behind all lives matter? But I'll get off my soapbox.
Thank you for that, and that's
Dr. Curtis,
truly powerful,
McCurtis.
and no, definitely.
Dr. McCurtis, if she wants to chime in.
I see the head nodding. Please do, Dr. McCurtis.
And it may or may not be that impactful, but I think it's similar to when also people say, I don't believe in systemic racism, or I don't believe in racism. And the core of that is that I don't see it, or I choose not to see it.
Right.
And so what you're telling me when you're saying all life matters is that I choose not to see Black lives.
Mm-hmm.
And whether they think that is, those who believe that, whether they think that is because you are acknowledging the greater good and our similarities, but you can't see our similarities if you can't see our differences as well. And so I think, you know, when people, I had this conversation with someone recently and they said, I don't think there is systemic racism. And I said, do you believe in God? And that person says, yes. And I said, have you ever seen God? And they said, well, I can feel God move. And I said, and I can feel systemic racism move. And now the country can too.
And just to add to that very quickly, and I know we're running quick on time. You know, it's the same people who say, well, I don't see color, right? I'm colorblind. Well, you are blind. If you're going to say that you don't see color, then you must be blind. Because anyone who can see, I mean, if you can see that this is a purple shirt versus a red shirt, then you do see color. So the fact to say that you are colorblind is a very erroneous statement. And then again, as Dr. McCurtis was sharing, you know, the notion that people want to turn a blind eye to racism or to Black lives, again, it's something that's been perpetuated in our history, right? And people feeling like this notion or this this group of people just really are so beneath them that they don't even see them, right? But yeah, I'll again get off my soapbox.
Can I just
Thank
add
you.
something?
Yeah, absolutely. Please, Dr. Gonzalez.
Earlier, as we were conversing, this thought came to mind in terms of like it being at the root of it. And once again, it popped into my mind again, which, part of it, or not part of it, we know that the root of all of this is as a society, how we center whiteness, we center power as well. And when I have a colleague who's is a person of color, and I remember we were having a speaker talk about education inequities, and she talked about her identity, and as a white teacher, marginalized during the classroom, so on and so forth. And my colleague, this person of color, was telling me how she was worried about how the white audience members felt. And she was wondering, like, wow, are they offended? Do they feel? She was concerned about how they were feeling. And it was at that point that she realized that's me centering whiteness. And I think that part of it is us being worried about this fragility that exists in talking about, everything that we talked about, like providing spaces and disrupting the classroom norms and that kind of, those kinds of concepts. It really is about decentering whiteness and the power that it comes with it, and really focusing on the lived experiences of everyone, and especially those who have been marginalized by the centering of whiteness. So when we talk, this conversation about Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter reminded me of that point as well, that it's really, rooted in the centering of whiteness that our society is so used to and needs to undo and unlearn.
And also, we have to, as people, we have to be unapologetic about what we prioritize, because it's very clear that this country has been unapologetic about what it prioritizes, as relates to, power, as it relates to political power, as it relates to economic power, and so forth. So by me saying all Black Lives Matter, it's just saying, look, I'm very unapologetic about what is priority for me and a group of people, because it's clear. It's clear. The same way that you can be unapologetic about, your stance and your positionality and your power and so forth, is the same way that I'm going to choose to be unapologetic.
So when we talk about the decentering whiteness, I do not disagree at all. Decentering whiteness, but I think we often miss a step before it, because the reality is anytime you are talking to somebody, you have to figure out, or it's best that you figure out what's important to them. So like when I do unconscious bias trainings or implicit bias trainings, and we talk about decentering whiteness. The reality is we have centered whiteness in this world in the US. And so it's difficult sometimes to pull apart some of that power that Dr. Gonzalez, or some of that, what is whiteness? Is this just what the academy is, or is this what white academy is? Is this what K through 12 education looks like, or is this what K through 12 education looks like in places with resources and privilege, and where their parents have light skin and they speak up in a different way, or they're heard in a different way? And so I think it's really important for us to, when we think about decentering, that we do, though, have to find a way that those people who will shut down and need to be in this conversation, white people have to be in this conversation, period. They won't save us. Absolutely, they will not. But they have to be in the conversation for us to be in America and grow together. And so I think it's important to make sure that while that decentering happens and should happen, we have to make sure that we're tapping into what's important to them so that they can hear and almost parallel. So just a quick example. So when I ask them people about their identities, and I may bring in nationality, may bring in language, may bring in, whether you're rural or urban. And so tapping into hearing what some of those things are, people can sometimes then make the leap to what it looks like to decenter what your own experiences are. But I find that a lot of times when we start with the decenter of whiteness, and not saying you were doing that at all, because I think it's a very important piece, I think we forget to make sure we're connecting to them. And a lot of my colleagues say, my DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion colleagues say, I don't care what they think, but you do, ultimately, because we need everybody for this fight and for this to win, ultimately, to win this war.
Wow, very, very powerful statements from you all, and I definitely wanted to save that one towards the end because I knew it would get the juices flowing and the passion going. So we are getting low on time here.
Waited too long.
So
Waited too long.
But I'm gonna leave this next question, which is our last question, to all of our panelists, and we'll start with Will to answer this one. And the question is simply, what is the one message you would like to relay to our viewers regarding this topic, regarding race, racism, and activism in education?
First and foremost, I think it's important to recognize that, and particularly for students of color, they matter. They are valuable. Their experiences are real. What they have to offer to this world is real in spite of the narratives that are being spun around. They have a responsibility to themselves, first and foremost, to inspire others. They also have the right to become inspired too, to love yourself as much as possible. And I think, at the very core of the work that, I think all of us as educators, love, I think, is a very, very fundamental catalyst for the work that we do. We can't pour from an empty cup, right? And so we have to find ways to fill our own cups. We have to find ways to help others fill their cups too. And overall, just ensure that you just ignite that love within yourself so that you can do whatever is necessary to make the changes for our nation.
All right, so I'm gonna get a touch esoteric on you. I think there is a collective consciousness that's happening in the world that we need to tap into it. And part of that collective consciousness is about really, who am I being right now? And who can I be? And so I think when we think about this topic, we think about race, we think about racism, we think about education. Education changes. I think we all believe that based on what we do. And what education looks like is different for different people. So learning versus, I'm not talking about necessarily from formal education, but I think one of the things we can do is educate ourselves on what has happened. But also think about, who am I being in this situation? Who can I bring my best to? Some of us don't say no enough. Some of us, figure I should be in the fight. But like my colleague Will over here said, if we're exhausted, what can you give? And so it's really important to be clear on who I am, what can I do, and when I can't do it, how I can refer them to other people.
I think the message that I have is along the lines of my colleague Will de los Santos stated, with regards to thinking about or acknowledging students' experiences, but not seeing it from a deficit-based or deficit view, right? Like thinking about their experiences as Tara Yoso's work, community cultural wealth, right? Like as wealth that they bring with them, and that helps them navigate these environments, and that their environments are not only the college setting, they don't only not necessarily reside, and that in their homes. So their homes may look different. They may have children. They may be taking care of ailing parents. And so these experiences, along with everything that they've lived so far, matter, but shouldn't be looked at from a deficit lens.
No, but one thing that I would share that in addition to what everyone has already stated, is that for the educators, this is a critical time. And one of the things that Dr. McCurdy shared was like, what does education look like? We are now in a space where we have to, as Dr. Adelaide Sanford, longtime educator in New York State, in New York City, she says that we have to educate for justice. We have to now begin educating from the lens of justice, and that's important. So for the educators who are viewing this, is what does educating for justice look like? What does that look like in your school, in your district, in your classroom, to really ensure that all the things that we've talked about in terms of creating spaces for student voice, empowering our students, supporting our students, helping them connect with what's happening in the communities in the world with their education, that's key. And generally for those who are seeing this, again, we are in a very critical time in our country and in the world. I haven't seen anything like this. When you see countries all over the world who are standing unapologetic in their demand for justice and social justice as it relates to Black Lives Matter. One thing that I certainly want to encourage everyone is to remain persistent in that pursuit. Let's not settle for the symbolism of change, right? We're seeing statues come down, we're seeing monuments come down, we're seeing, schools being renamed. That's nice and symbolic, but we have to remain persistent in the systemic change that's necessary to provide and create the equity that's necessary from in all realms, so that we can get to a point where we can say all lives matter.
Wow, this was an amazing panel with an amazing group of people. I am so blessed and fortunate to know all of you, and this was truly powerful as I expected. So thank you all for being part of this panel on race, racism, and activism in education. And this is Mike from ReachingHigherEd.com, and thank you to all our viewers, and thank you to all our panelists. We will pick up with our series in future videos, and I do hope that some of you will join again. And thank you for everyone for being a part of what we're doing here today.